name is Sarah Omar, and I'm an assistant professor in Arabic and Islamic Studies here at Georgetown University. I'd like to welcome you to our series where you get to meet scholars and hear them discuss their intellectual journeys. My guest today is Dr. Kathryn Babayan, professor at the University of Michigan. You could find her full biography on this page. Dr. Babayan, welcome, and thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be able to. This is my first time where I'm actually really thinking and reflecting on my career. My name is Kathryn Babayan. I'm an early modern Persianate historian of social and cultural historian. Persianate is just a newer way, a more maybe accurate way of associating the areas that I study in this pre-modern period before Iran was a nation state, right? So I would have said maybe 10 years ago, I'm a historian of early modern Iranian world, but things have changed and there's a very rich field that I also feel that I'm part of in Persianate studies. So, you know, as far as my career trajectory, I think, at least for my purposes, politics, the personal and the professional are very much intertwined. And I think having come of age in Iran right before the revolution had a very important impact on the direction that I've taken in my studies. First of all, as high school students, we were very politicized. We were very cognizant of authoritarian regimes, very cognizant also of American imperialism and of social inequities. And I think so these are sort of a political upbringing and consciousness that I have carried throughout my career. And when I came to study, ironically, in the United States, because the United States was known to be, and I think still continues to be, a place if you wanted to make it and be educated, to come here. I know, of course, it was an ambivalent relationship with the US. And I started my undergraduate degree at a small college, at Wellesley College, always with this curiosity about the Iranian Revolution and the religious turn that the Iranian Revolution took. And it's actually really, I think, nice to see that 40 years later, there is a very robust field in Iranian studies and Iranian studies around the modern period and revolutions. But when I was at Wellesley, there was not one class on Iranian history, and there was nothing on the Middle East. And so that thirst and desire really had to be fulfilled in some way with my own readings. And even at that time, there was very little written about the Iranian Revolution. I took classes about Chinese Revolution and the Russian Revolution. And so those were sort of the revolutionary sort of transformations and what it means and how, you know, the genealogies of revolutions were something that really interested me. And I continued that interest at Georgetown itself. I have a master's degree in the modern Middle East, but there again, it was, and I knew that that was the case, that it was mostly the Arab world that was being taught. I had a wonderful teacher in Hana Batatu, who worked on the Iraqi communists. But there too, I must say that desire really to understand the experience that I had gone through itself of the revolution was, I think, something that nagged at me. And I was confused. I have to say it's really important for undergraduates to hear that it's okay to be confused. It's a good state of mind to be. I think I find undergraduates nowadays very set in their ways. And I tried different things. I worked at a bookstore. I did some research at the Smithsonian as well. And I must say it was a book that I read that had just come out in 1984 by Said Amir Arjomand, The Shadow of God on Earth, that actually created and wrote this narrative of modern Iran and Shia history, all the way back to the early Islamic world. And I think I was really inspired. And the Safavids became the space where I thought, okay, if I really want to understand the revolution, I need to go back in time, where this first empire establishes Shiism as the religion of state. And so that sort of began a new career for me, right? I went to graduate school. I went to Princeton, where I thought, and it came out for sure, that the best Safavi historian was teaching Martin Dixon. He was a wonderful mentor. I was very lucky because he opened up this world for me that then, really drew me to the past. And I must say, I was always not very interested in the modern period, because I felt that there was too much that it seemed like we knew. And once this past was opened up to me, I felt the opacity, the difference, the unknowability, so much of it being really a puzzle, was something that was much more challenging for me. And so I began my journey as a Safavi historian. I was exposed, in the Department of Near Eastern Studies, to a very traditional education, a philological based education in Near Eastern Studies and in Safavi history. But my advisor was one who was a renegade. And so actually really turned me on to my first passion, who were the Ghazelbosh, these redheads who were part of a mystical brotherhood of the Safavids, and who were cast in the literature even of the time in the 16th century as extremists, as exaggerators, the quluf, which actually goes back to the early Islamic period. And so I became really drawn to their ideas, questioning the whole criteria of how does, Shiism become a religion of empire and everybody just converts all of a sudden. And that, with my own experience, was a very difficult one to understand historically, that change, these kinds of change and transformations, these social revolutions actually take time. There are resistance. And so I began to study their ideology, an ideology that had been censored out of the history books, because the Safavis began as extremists, or I rather call them exaggerators, and they came to be associated with heresy. And so that was another intervention in the field, because first of all, the field was such that religion was studied as a textual tradition. And so religiosity couldn't be experiential, couldn't be about cultural history, couldn't be about social history as well. And I really wanted to give credence to, or try to understand, these so-called heretics on their own terms. And in the process of my research, it really came out that, in fact, these kinds of attitudes of reincarnation, of transmigration of the soul, were more hegemonic at the time than, in fact, being marginal. And that was very much of a modern construction of this past. And I think I was lucky too, because I had an advisor who allowed me to do what I wanted to do, in the sense that to actually grow. And so I went into classes in European history with Natalie Zeman Davis. She herself, having been affected by the feminist revolutions of the 1960s, herself a Marxist, and really interested in social history and, of course, women's history. And so I learned a lot of these methods of doing cultural history, doing the kind of gender history through reading her work and taking her classes. And I must say another real inspiration for me was Peter Brown, who was another renegade late antique historian who refused to study religion in the way in which late antique scholars would, and really look at religion as a social phenomena. And so those were some of the influences that shaped my education, let's say, in graduate school. But I have to say that I was also restricted. So circumstance is really critical on the direction that I took, in that I had an Iranian passport. I was on an American visa, and before the Muslim ban, there was the Iranian ban. And so we could not travel to Iran to do research, because then there's no US embassy in Iran. It was very difficult to come back to the States. So I was limited to certain kinds of sources, to chronicles, to court chronicles. I wasn't interested in doing court history, but I thought, you're thinking about method, that I could read these chronicles differently, right? I could read them for revolts and for social protest. I could read them for gender politics. That's where women appear at the court of the Safavids as well as eunuchs and slaves. So I began to be interested really in this kind of power dynamics at court with, what one would call marginal, but they were really not marginal figures, because they were there, very powerful at court. But I have to say that there is a desire that I have. I have come in time to realize I like to be on the margins myself. I'm an Armenian who grew up in Iran, but I feel comfortable in some ways on the margins. I think the margins force you to push yourself to think and to see differently as well. So this interest then in heresy, as well as in women and slaves, really emerge from this different kind of reading of the chronicles, and then finding little gems like a fatwa that a cleric had written against those reciters of Abu Muslim Names, epics of Abu Muslim. And so cutting off their tongues, washing off their story, their sort of scrolls of stories. And so I began to think about why, 1,000 years later, would Abu Muslim be such a taboo subject. And so that sort of linked me to the Ghulat as far as a genealogy of the Ghazalbash to the early Islamic period. But my desire to do social history stayed with me. And so the desire to try to find other kinds of sources. And so the first time I was able to go back to Iran on a green card, once I had my first job, I went to the libraries really in search of sort of these voices that were not mediated by a chronicler, right, by a poet, for instance, in a way to access voices from the past as they wrote their own histories or their own stories as well. And I came across in this long process of looking at the catalogs, these anthologies, majmuas, which normally are collections, are known to be collections of single subjects, but in fact what I would see is diaries, marriage contracts, wills, letters, personal letters. And so that became then a space for the second book project, which will be coming out, of thinking about what these meant. So I think that the methods has something to do with, first of all, bringing different kinds of sources. So I've included visuals as well, whatever is produced from that moment in time that allows you to go into this history of ideas, of mentalities, of experiences, which is a big break away from the more positivistic training, let's say, that I had received at the Near Eastern Studies department, but really to enter into also then trying to figure out what these anthologies were. Why were there thousands of anthologies collected and preserved in 17th century Esfahan? And so my book is really one understanding of these productions of anthologies as household archives, where families actually kind of brought together pieces of poetry, pieces of essays, their own personal letters, collected them in like a scrapbook in their own households. And that's where one of the female voices that I've written an article about, but she's also a chapter of my book, who writes her pilgrimage to Mecca and Medina, and there, you know, as she goes to Tabriz in northwestern Iran, sort of does a detour and goes and visits and divulges a very intimate female-female relationship that, you know, allowed me again to enter into these experiences that people had, that she wrote herself in a language, in a beautiful poetic language, a very simple poetic language that allowed me, yes, I've only found one woman of the sort, but allowed me to posit that women, of course, were part of the household, did read these majmuas and anthologies, and very much, of course, she comes from a bureaucratic family, so there's a family of privilege where literature matters, but that there must be other voices that I could retrieve from the past and place them really in dialogue, as a good gender and sexuality historian should do, with men as well.
Wow, this is, I mean, this is really fascinating, and I'm so so lucky and fortunate to have heard you contextualize your work and bring it all together for us. This is such a pleasure to have you on, and such a pleasure to have the opportunity to talk to you. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah.